500 Americans gone. Without a warning, it began quietly. No headlines, no tweets, no outrage. Just whispers in diplomatic halls, eyes narrowing in high places, and documents stamped in shadows. On a humid morning in Ouagadougou, President Ibrahim Traoré stood at the edge of his private garden, his back to the sprawling city he swore to protect. His hands trembled, not from fear, but fury. For too long, his people had been treated like pawns in a global game that cared nothing for Africa's roots, wounds, or rise. Traoré, the youngest African leader in a century, wasn't born into privilege. He rose through fire, first as a soldier, then a revolutionary, and now a symbol of Pan-African power. But he had grown tired of the subtle insults hidden in trade deals and humanitarian aid contracts, always favoring Western interests. He had stayed silent when his country's uranium was shipped off while villages lived without electricity. He remained calm when foreign aid workers built fences between Africa's pain and its pride. But everything changed the day he received a confidential report, one that listed the names of 500 Americans operating across his nation, most without proper clearance. Some were private contractors disguised as diplomats, others linked to data mining operations, and many embedded in what was called soft intelligence outreach. The report, detailed and damning, came from one of Traoré's own intelligence, officers trained abroad but loyal to the soil of Burkina Faso. His ministers advised caution. The American embassy requested a quiet meeting, but Traoré refused both. He called for a press conference, stood before the cameras, and with the calm voice of a man who had slept in trenches declared, "Today we take back our dignity. These 500 individuals must leave Burkinabe soil within 72 hours. No exception, no negotiation. Africa is not a playground." The world gasped, Washington fumbled, and in the White House, Donald Trump, though no longer president, stormed onto television, branding Traoré a radical dictator and enemy of freedom. But Traoré was unmoved. In the capital city, people poured into the streets not in protest but celebration. Old women danced in markets. University students painted murals of lions reclaiming thrones. For the first time in decades, it felt like Africa wasn't asking for permission. It was drawing a line. But this story wasn't just about a speech. It was about decades of resentment boiling beneath trade smiles. America had underestimated one thing. Africa was listening, learning, and finally leading. Back in Washington, retired officials scrambled to understand what had just happened. How could one man, one leader, dare to defy the United States in such a public, unflinching way? What emboldened Traoré to not only bite the hand that fed, but to expose the hand's greed? What they didn't realize was that Africa had been waiting for a leader who would speak not in whispers, but thunder, waiting for a leader who would choose sovereignty over silence. And Traoré had become that voice. Meanwhile, inside the American embassy in Ouagadougou, panic spread like fire. Emails flooded from Washington. Embassy staff were ordered to list names, scan passports, and prepare for emergency evacuations. Those targeted by the expulsion order were stunned. Many believed they were operating under mutual agreements, unaware. They had overstayed invisible boundaries drawn by history. Among them was Karen Delaney, a cultural liaison who had spent 5 years in Burkina Faso teaching English and running community workshops. She had built relationships, grown fond of the culture, and even adopted local dress. But now she was labeled part of the problem. Her heart sank not from guilt, but confusion, and yet Traoré's orders were clear. No categories, no negotiations. Leave. For the Americans being escorted out, it felt surreal. For the Burkinabe, citizens watching them go, it felt like a sunrise after decades of dusk. Back in Washington, Trump's voice echoed across conservative media. He warned of a growing African hostility, mocked Traoré's background as a barefoot rebel, and accused the Biden administration of letting barbaric nationalism rise unchecked. But beneath the noise, something deeper stirred. Traoré's message wasn't just for Burkina Faso, it was for the whole continent. In Kenya, young activists tweeted support. In Nigeria, radio hosts praised his courage. In South Africa, students chanted his name during university protests. The Lion of the Sahel, they called him. And in the background, other African leaders watched, some with admiration, others with fear. Could this bold move be the start of a continental shift? If Burkina Faso could challenge the U.S., what could stop others from reclaiming their own authority? As the last plane carrying deported Americans lifted off the tarmac, a thunderstorm rolled over the horizon. The sky cracked not with rain, but reckoning. President Ibrahim Traoré watched from his office, silent but certain. He knew the retaliation would come. Sanctions, media slander, political isolation. But he also knew history had just changed course, and sometimes a lion must roar even if the jungle isn't ready. The decision had been made, but its aftershock was only beginning. Within 24 hours of President Ibrahim Traoré's announcement, international headlines blared with disbelief. Africa expels U.S. citizens. Burkina Faso declares. War on Western influence. Trump demands sanctions against rogue leader. Yet inside the presidential compound in Ouagadougou, Traoré remained composed, issuing instructions not from a place of anger, but vision. While the world called it an act of rebellion, Traoré saw it as reclamation. He knew the West would respond, with fury. What he didn't expect was the spark he had ignited across Africa. In Senegal, university halls buzzed with debates. In Ghana, ministers quietly discussed their own diplomatic contracts. In Mali and Niger, soldiers patrolling borders felt a new sense of pride. The action Traoré took, so bold, so swift, made many African citizens question, why had we tolerated so much for so long? But in Washington, chaos brewed. Former President Donald Trump, though out of office, was a flame that wouldn't die. His words, always loud and cutting, now turned into a national echo chamber. He demanded that Congress freeze all aid to Burkina. He went on television to call Traoré a military thug who just declared Cold War 2.0. Inside the Oval Office, President Biden treaded more carefully. His advisors were torn. Retaliating too harshly might escalate African resistance. Appearing weak could cost him politically. So they crafted a middle path, suspending certain development funds, placing travel restrictions, and calling for an emergency summit with ECOWAS leaders. But Traoré refused to attend. Instead, he sent a letter that would be read aloud in front of the world. It was handwritten, translated into 3 languages, and signed with his personal seal. We are not your project. We are not your threat. We are not your burden. We are a people reclaiming our rhythm. If your presence weakens our identity, it is your presence, not our identity, that must go. The room fell silent when it was read aloud. Cameras captured the moment, and within hours the quote trended globally. Artists printed it on shirts. African youth posted it as profile banners. And slowly, the global conversation began to shift. Traoré didn't hate America. He didn't even want isolation. What he demanded was mutual respect, not charity with chains. He believed that Africa didn't need rescuing. It needed space to rise, to fail, to build, and to stand tall on its own terms. Yet behind the curtain of courage, the weight of the decision began to show. Food prices in Ouagadougou spiked. Several NGOs halted operations. US-based tech firms pulled out of local projects. In remote hospitals, donated American equipment stopped arriving. And Traoré's economic advisors warned that the fallout could plunge the country into recession within 6 months. But still, he didn't back down. He went live on national television again, not as a politician but as a teacher. He sat on a simple stool dressed in a cotton tunic and spoke to the people with a quiet fire. If pain is the price of freedom, then we must pay it. Not for ego, not for pride, but for the children who will never know what it means to bow while standing. And that night, something extraordinary happened. Villagers began sending grain and dried fish to cities to help the poor. Blacksmiths and traders offered discounts to families affected by the embargoes. Schools organized free tutoring sessions. When American education grants disappeared, it wasn't a government response. It was a people's response, and it carried a simple message: we stand with our lion. Across the Atlantic, Trump wasn't done. He staged a press conference flanked by conservative politicians and former generals. With furrowed brows and dramatic flair, he warned that Burkina Faso may soon become a terrorist breeding ground, and that weakness in Africa will invite enemies of freedom. But even in the U.S., not everyone bought into the fear. Black American activists saw Traoré as a revolutionary voice. African immigrants in Chicago and Atlanta organized forums, calling for the West to listen, not lecture. For the first time in decades, an African president's words were being studied, not ridiculed, in Ivy League classrooms. Meanwhile, inside Burkina Faso, Traoré met with regional elders. They weren't politicians, but the keepers of oral tradition, men and women whose wisdom had long guided the community in silence. One elder, her face lined with age and memory, said, "You have opened the gate to the storm, son. But remember, even lions bleed. Guard your heart and your people." Traoré nodded. He was no fool. He knew every revolution needed roots, or it would be swept away by wind. So he began to reform quietly, pushing for Pan-African trade networks, investing in local agriculture, calling for an African digital platform free of Western surveillance. But the backlash continued. A U.S. senator introduced a bill to classify Burkina Faso as a restricted ally. A popular American news anchor claimed that Traoré had links to Russian mercenaries, though no evidence ever emerged. Meanwhile, cyber attacks targeted several Burkinabe government websites, and rumors swirled of planned coups supported by foreign hands. But inside the country, support for Traoré only deepened. He wasn't perfect. He made mistakes, but he had done something few leaders dared to do. He chose the people's pride over political comfort. He took a stand not because it was popular, but because it was necessary. And perhaps most importantly, he reminded the world that Africa is not a monolith of poverty and passivity. It is a continent of courage, memory, and awakening. A lion does not need permission to roar, and as the final 500 Americans crossed the border, carrying their suitcases and questions, many of them looked back not with anger, but reflection. Some even nodded, for in that soil, something sacred had been stirred. The world had seen uprisings. It had witnessed coups, revolutions, and protests. But what President IBRAHIM Traoré had done was different. He didn't raise arms. He raised standards. He didn't call for war. He called for dignity. And by expelling 500 Americans without warning, he didn't just challenge a superpower. He awakened a continent. Weeks after the deportations, the international response intensified. American senators demanded more sanctions. Western think tanks labeled Burkina Faso as unstable. Editorials warned of a new wave of anti-Westernism rooted in misguided nationalism. But none of it slowed Traoré. Instead, what followed was unexpected. From Nairobi to Accra, young Africans began organizing, not in protest, but in purpose. Online forums erupted with conversations about local governance, sovereignty, and decolonizing education systems. Hashtags like Pride Not Permission and African Dignity trended for days. In Côte d'Ivoire, university students raised funds to launch a homegrown tech startup after a U.S. firm pulled out. In Cameroon, musicians released songs praising Traoré as the lion who roared for us all. In Liberia, market women started trading in local fabrics instead of imported Western goods, calling it Traoré Tuesdays. But perhaps the most dramatic shift came from within African leadership circles. For decades, the African Union had been seen as a bureaucratic symbol, full of summits, but empty of substance. Yet following Traoré's defiance, the AU held an emergency session. Delegates from 42 nations gathered in Addis Ababa to debate one question: Is it time for Africa to redefine its partnerships with the West? The debate was fiery. Some feared economic retaliation, others saw opportunity. But what none could deny was that Traoré's stand had shattered silence. At the heart of the summit, a surprise motion was introduced, the Sovereignty Accord, calling for a review of all foreign military, development, and intelligence operations on African soil within the next 24 months. The motion passed with overwhelming support. And just like that, what began as one man's decision had become a movement. Meanwhile, in the U.S., Trump continued his attacks. He called Traoré a puppet of global adversaries, accused him of destroying goodwill, and warned that Burkina Faso would regret this betrayal for generations. But the American public was divided. Some feared that Africa was turning hostile, but others, especially younger Americans, began questioning their own assumptions. Podcasts, documentaries, and talk shows started unpacking Africa's history with the West, its exploitation, its resistance, its resilience. For many, it was the first time hearing these stories. Back in Burkina Faso, the real test had begun. Without Western aid, the economy strained. Imports became scarce. Tourism declined. Opposition parties accused Traoré of recklessness. Foreign investors backed out of deals. But through it all, a sense of purpose bound the nation. Communities built local co-ops to produce soap, cloth, and canned food. Farmers taught urban youth to grow rooftop gardens. Teachers created low-cost curriculums written in native languages. What Burkina Faso lost in money, it gained in memory. And through it all, Traoré refused to gloat. He rarely appeared on international media. He declined interviews. Instead, he continued holding village town halls, sitting on wooden benches, speaking in simple phrases. It is better to walk on thorns with your head high than to ride on velvet with a bowed neck, he once told a crowd of teenage students in Koudougou. That line was carved into murals, quoted in rap songs, printed in school textbooks. Meanwhile, in the U.S., Trump finally crossed a line. In a live televised segment, he implied that the U.S. should consider economic deterrence, even covert influence, to replace dangerous African radicals. His words were condemned globally, but the damage had been done. The African Union issued a rare joint statement calling the remarks a direct insult to African sovereignty. Multiple African ambassadors demanded public apologies. Even the United Nations intervened, urging constructive engagement over coercive diplomacy. But for Traoré, this was no longer about Trump, or Biden, or any single Western figure. It was about memory, legacy, the stories his grandfather told him, as a boy, of kingdoms that traded gold and wisdom long before colonial flags were ever planted. The stories of queens and poets, of resistance fighters and healers, of ancestors buried with pride and not permission. And so, on the anniversary of the expulsion, Traoré called for a national celebration, not to mock America, but to honor Africa. He declared it Dignity Day. Across Burkina Faso, streets were filled with drumming, dancing, and prayer. School children performed plays about historical African heroes. Elders told stories around fire pits. And in the capital, a massive lion sculpture was unveiled, cast from melted-down pieces of decommissioned foreign equipment once used to surveil their land. It was named Roar of the Soil. And in a rare global broadcast, Traoré addressed not governments, but the world's youth. If you are told your worth is measured in donations, stand taller. If they say your voice is too angry, speak clearer. If they call your courage dangerous, then they fear your truth. Africa is not rising, we have risen. And this time we do not rise alone, we rise aware. The speech echoed across nations. And even in the U.S., a shift had begun. African-American communities found pride in Traoré's journey. Universities launched courses titled Modern African Sovereignty. Progressive leaders began reevaluating foreign policy priorities. Even some former critics admitted, the lion may not be perfect, but he is powerful. In the end, Traoré didn't become a global hero because he expelled Americans. He became a symbol because he demanded to be seen, not as a recipient, but as a partner. And as the dust of diplomacy settled, the world realized something profound. The days of one continent writing the script for another were fading. A new voice had emerged, one that didn't need translation, one that didn't ask to be heard but made itself undeniable. It wasn't just Trump who cried out, it was history itself, stunned that the silence had finally been broken.